Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thanks so much for tuning in today for a very special episode about the Texas Revolution. When we think of the Texas Revolution, what do we think of? We think of the battles, we think of the Army, we think maybe a little bit about the government, the Declaration of Independence, the new Constitution drafted at Washington on the Brazos. But there's part of the Revolution that we really don't give much thought to, and it certainly hadn't been written about very much, but it went a long way toward forming our identity as Texans, and that is the Runaway Scrape. The Runaway Scrape is a term that describes a situation where the citizens of Texas fled for their lives ahead of the Mexican army, starting a little bit after the fall of the Alamo and lasting all the way through the Battle of San Jacinto. These people dropped everything. They grabbed only what they could carry, any wagon if they had one, and they fled east. As Houston marched the Texian army eastward, the citizens followed. Food was left on tables. Milk was left in cups. This was all documented by Mexican army that came onto these farms to take their food. People gathered in large groups, which begat disease. People died and, by necessity, were buried where they fell. This was a huge refugee crisis. But as I said, it hasn't been written about very much until now. Dr. Stephen Hardin is with us today. He is, without question, the preeminent historian on the Texas Revolution. His books include Texian Iliad, which is a military history of the Texas Revolution, Texian Macabre, which is a story of a hanging in early Houston and is one of the better histories of early Houston that's ever been written. He compiled a series of lectures on the Texas Revolution and the formation of Texas called Lust for Glory, which I highly recommend. He wrote a book about the Alamo, and his latest book is called Texian Exodus, The Runaway Scrape and Its Enduring Legacy. In this interview, he's going to talk about how he came to write the book, why he came to write the book, what he discovered, and you're really going to enjoy it, and you're going to learn a lot. So without further ado, here is Dr. Stephen Hardin. Dr. Hardin, welcome back to Wise About Texas, and thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Ken.
Well, it's always a thrill to have you. You are clearly the preeminent historian of the Texas Revolution time period, and just when we thought we knew everything about the Revolution, along comes your newest work, Texian Exodus, about the Runaway Scrape. Tell our readers, just give them listeners, I should say, an overview of the Runaway Scrape and why you picked this as a topic.
Well, short version is that the Runaway Scrape, or sometimes called the Sabine Chute, was the mass exodus, excuse the term, of the Anglo-American civilians and sometimes soldiers as well, trying to escape the advance of Santana's Mexican army in the spring of 1836. It was an ordeal for everyone involved. The weather was just awful. The roads were just as bad. People became ill. It was Texians plundered other Texians. So it was a bona fide refugee crisis. And I just wondered why everybody had forgotten this critical episode in Texas history, but they sure had.
Well, what sort of started this? Because you're right. I think people don't think about this aspect of the revolution. They think about the army, the Battle of Concepcion, obviously the Alamo, the Goliad, all of those things. And you think about a war, you think about those battles, and somebody wins, somebody loses. We end up at San Jacinto.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all that, this occurs. What started it, and where did it begin?
Well, in my own journey, I came to understand that most Texas historians, and I'm not excluding that Hardin guy, viewed the Runaway Scrape as a sideshow to the main events, the Alamo, Goliad, San Jacinto. And the main event was the San Jacinto campaign with Sam Houston as the ringmaster. But the more I delved into this, the more I came to understand that for 90% of the civilians in Texas, the Runaway Scrape was the main event. It was the event that impacted them most powerfully. And I mean, it was their war. And I came upon a fellow who was a non-Texan just visiting. But he said all the early Texians used to reference things that happened before the Runaway Scrape and after the Runaway Scrape. There were fewer than 1,000 Texian combatants at the Battle of San Jacinto. But virtually the entire population of Texas, and we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 people, were impacted by the Runaway Scrape. And yet, not much had been written about it. And when I started my research, I was concerned. I said, well, am I going to find anything? I found a ton of stuff. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I did find, a lot of it by the people themselves, reminiscing about their experiences. And I think the reason they were so compelled to record their experiences is they understood, even if we do not, how vital an episode that was to their own lives and to Texas history.
One of the things that really struck me when I read the book was how detailed, like you said, how many accounts there were and how detailed they were. How did you go about compiling all this?
Well, as you know, at the front of the book, I have a listing of all the participants that had accounts that I drew on, and it double columned. It went into 2 pages. So I perused the primary literature, the books, the letters, the newspaper accounts, the early documents, and I just kept finding more and more material from people who felt obliged to describe their experience. And I think the reason they did that is because they didn't want people to forget what they had endured, what they had suffered. And after all that, that's exactly what we did. I went to a speaking engagement a couple of months back, and there was a lady in the audience who was a 7th grade Texas history teacher. And she said, in my 7th grade Texas history textbook, do you know how much space they devote to the Runaway Scrape? I said, I have no idea. She said, 1 paragraph.
Oh, my gosh.
1 paragraph. And that's typical. While I was in the months and years I spent researching this book, friends quite naturally would ask me, "Steve, what are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a soup to nuts book on the Runaway Scrape." And there would be a puzzled look, and so, well, what's that? Now, understand, most of my friends have an interest in Texas history. They are Texans, fellow Texans. And that gave me pause. I thought to myself, well, that doesn't bode well for sales. But I think it increased my purpose because I knew, and I've spoken several times, and I always begin says, "Now be honest now, because I don't care." How many of you had ever heard of the Runaway Scrape before you came here tonight? And inevitably, it's a third to half of the audience. And again, this is in Texas.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah, well, that's right. And that's why I wrote the book, because Texians had recorded this, but modern day Texans, for whatever reason, and I've got my theories, but had completely erased this pivotal event from their collective memories.
What did you find of all the many accounts that you read? What were sort of the leaders, as far as, in your opinion, as a historian, authoritative or more thorough or more impactful?
Well, you can't help but fall in love with Delia Rose, known to most people as Delia Rose Harris. Harris was her married name. And she published an account in it was one of the very early issues of the quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association, before it became Southwestern Historical Quarterly. And these were her reminiscences, written as an old woman. And we have had that account for many, many years. And if, people talk about the Runaway Scrape, they use that early article. Now, I was surprised to find out that her original handwritten manuscript survives at the San Jacinto Monument at the Hertzberg Library. And I got a transcript, and I saw what she had actually written and the way she actually wrote it. And what I came to understand was that the article that we've been quoting from since the early 20th century was heavily, and I mean heavily, edited by the people at the TSHA staff.
Wow.
And they cleaned up her language, they cleaned up her punctuation, they cleaned up her grammar, they actually added stuff to her. So I said, well, now that was a real surprise, because I don't want to be too critical of people at TSHA, because that may have been the norm at that time. But the norm today, at least among academic historians, is you don't jack with a quotation. You publish it exactly as you find it. And that's what I did. I mean, warts and all. I said, I mean, for the first time, I want people to see what Delia actually wrote the way she wrote it. And I could understand the desire to smooth out the edges for readability, but I also think there's value in presenting the words exactly as they wrote them. I think you get an authenticity there that, is valuable.
No, I agree with that, especially in a time when revisions are being made that aren't so honest.
Yeah.
But she's only one of many that you put together. In fact, I made a comment to you upon reading this that you may recall that this will become a reference book for your fellow historians, because I can anticipate going back to it frequently for source material on these matters. But at the same,
I hope you're right. I hope people will use the book. I hope they'll find it useful. And I tried to the extent that it was possible, like I say, soup to nuts. I wanted this to be a book that would stand the test of time. Of course, that's a goal for all the books I write, but and never more so than this one, simply because we had forgotten this episode. And in terms, because so many people were involved in this mad exodus to the Sabine River or Galveston Island, as a formative event in which so many people were involved, I argue that it's more important than the Battle of San Jacinto, because not a lot of people were involved in the Battle of San Jacinto, but most Anglo-American Texians were involved in some way, were impacted in some way by the Runaway Scrape. So for these people, like I say, this was the main event. This, when you talk about the Texas Revolution, this is the event they participated in. This is the event they remembered. And I just thought it was a shame that we don't or didn't. I hope this book will cause more people to remember it. I hope future textbooks will include more than a paragraph.
I'm curious, did you find in your research many Mexican sources, Mexican Army accounts of the people fleeing ahead of them?
Yeah. I mean, it was something they noticed. I found a letter from Santana to Fiesole, his second in command, written from Harrisburg. After he had burned the place. And he says, Houston, latest reports on Houston is that he is retiring toward Nacogdoches, but he will be delayed by the flooding Trinity River. He is accompanied by hundreds of civilians. They're pulling ox carts. That'll slow him down. So clearly, Santana knew about the Runaway Scrape. And in fact, I say this in the book. He had intended to mount a terror campaign. He had done this before in Zacatecas, and I think it was his stated goal to run all the perfidious foreigners, his term, out of Texas. And if he could, with events like the Alamo and the Goliad Massacre, his no quarter policy. I believe he was trying to frighten people, to convince them that it was in their best interest to abandon Texas. And in the short run, that scheme was successful. But in the long run, he created a solidarity among Texians that had never existed before. I mean, these were some of the most independent people on earth, and yet it was during the Runaway Scrape that it became important, that it became vital that they work in concert, that they help one another. And in that process, they formed a Texian identity. As I say in the book, the Runaway Scrape served as a cultural boot camp for Texans. And that's the first time that this phenomenon of a Texian identity. And of course, this is something that all Texans are proud of. I relate an incident in the book. My family were vacationing in London, and we were visiting a place called the London Dungeon. This is a place that looks at English history through the lens of gallows humor. And there are several exhibits, and what people do is they form into groups, and then their group at a certain time goes on the tour. Well, we were waiting there for our tour to begin and started talking to some of our neighbors, and were surprised to find a surprisingly high number of Texans in our group. So, of course, when a Texan meets another Texan, especially out of state, or in this case, out of country, they say, well, where are you from? And Well, we formed an unofficial posse, and we, went through the exhibits together. And at the end, we're exchanging names and numbers and saying, well, if you're ever in El Paso, if you're ever in Amarillo, if you're ever in Victoria, look us up. We'd love to take you to. And I just about every Texan I know has an experience like that.
For sure, yes.
And I think the Runaway Scrape is one of the reasons that in times of crisis, most Texans, I don't say all Texans, but most Texans try to help each other out, try to help their neighbors. And we've seen that time after time.
And this was the first time that it became urgently necessary, obviously.
Well, I believe prior to that, I'm not saying that Texians did not suffer hardships before the Runaway Scrape. But they dealt with their problems, they dealt with that hardship as individuals and families.
Yeah.
This was the first time that they became, Santana made them an endangered species. And it didn't really matter if you were a plantation owner or a small cotton farmer, whether you were a slave owner or an abolitionist. It didn't matter because Santana had them all scheduled for the chopping block. So that formed something that really hadn't had before, and that was a community, a community of interest, because they were all threatened. They were all in the same boat. So I think that led to an identity. I mean, I don't think their Texian identity had been that important to them until it became a matter of life and death. And as I say in the book, it's rather ironic that the fellow who, and by the way, Stephen F. Austin hadn't been able to achieve this. Sam Houston hadn't been able to achieve this. David G. Burnett hadn't been able to achieve this. Who achieved that? Ironically, Antonio Lopez de Santana. So, boy, did he screw up.
Yeah, he really did. Well, they describe, if you can, just kind of an overview. When you say people fled their homes, people retreated, people suffered hardship, give us a little detail about that.
Well, here's another thing.
How bad was it, I guess, is what I'm asking you.
Is as bad as you can imagine. The spring of 1836 was unusually cold. By mid-March, early April, in Texas, it usually starts warming up. That's about the time we first see blue bonnets. If spring's not here, spring's just around the corner. But the winter of 1836 lingered and kept Texas in its icy grip. So it's unseasonably cold. Also, around mid-March, at the exact time that most people are abandoning their homes, it begins raining. And even old-timers said they couldn't remember a spring where it rained this much. And it rained off and on for 6 weeks. So that's through the Battle of San Jacinto and after. And some of the hardships, some of the most extreme, were suffered not on the way out, but on the way back. I mean, Mexicans were no longer an issue, but it's not unlike the Trail of Tears, where people are forcibly removed from their homes and exposed to the elements. And the very fact that there are throngs of people on the road, and the irony is, people left their homes because they were deemed unsafe, because the Mexicans are coming, we need to get out of here. But they fell in with large groups of people. Now, these are not people who had spent a lot of time around large groups of people. And they began to suffer from diseases that are typical in cities. And like I mentioned the Trail of Tears earlier, like the Trail of Tears, people died. And the people most at risk were the very young and the very old. And there were hundreds. I mean, as I say in the book, we really don't know how many people died. We have references from the people talking about their loved ones who died. So we know a lot of people died. We just don't have that exact number because, society broke down. People who would have kept records are on the road. So not only did Texians lose family members, loved ones, they also lost great swaths of their history. I mean, there's just so much we don't know because all the record keeping ceased to occur. So, I mean, think of something as simple as a death certificate. Nobody's taking care of niceties like that. I mean, the entire society had broken down in this chaotic evacuation. And people used to record births and deaths in the family Bible. But even there, a lot of those Bibles went up in flames when the Mexicans burned San Felipe, Gonzales, Brazoria, in individual cabins. So something as simple as a family Bible, we lost those.
Yeah, an awful experience. What do you think? What do you think you would like people to take away from this book when they read it?
Well, I have a theory, and that theory is that Texians traditionally have been embarrassed by the runaway scrape. I mean, the very term runaway scrape is somewhat self-effacing, somewhat self-critical. I mean, how can you praise the mass evacuation of almost the entire civilian population? And I think Texians Texians first and Texans afterwards, would just rather remember the Alamo, where the few stood against many and fell as heroes. I think they would prefer to remember the redemption of San Jacinto, where, again, few attacked many, won against long odds. But the runaway scrape just seems so craven until you get into the individual stories. And you find that many of these people, even though they're running away, I mean, there are moments of heroism, there are moments of compassion, there are moments of fortitude that we can be proud of and should be proud of if we knew anything about it. So now, that's not everybody. You also had numerous episodes of Texians plundering other Texans, people taking advantage of this terrible crisis to loot, to steal, to plunder. And that's unfortunate, but that's also part of this story. And I've got a whole chapter about Texians looting other Texans.
Well, that's a tale as old as time, I suppose. Well, the book's extraordinarily well written, as always. Your writing is eminently readable, brilliant. Some would say. I would say. What's your next book on the Texas Revolution? Do you have anything planned?
No. I'm.
So you're taking suggestions from the listeners, is
Well,
what I'm hearing.
I'm taking a breather. I started Exodus in 2019, and you will remember what happened in 2019. There's a reason they call it COVID-19. So I could not have picked a worse time to work on the book. The archives in Austin, the places, Rosenberg, where the documents live. It was about a year before I could get into them. So my research was stymied. I did what I could, but fact of the matter is, this book took a lot longer than it should have. It was eventually published in 2024, but I have never worked harder on a book than I have this one. But there's also not a book I'm prouder of. But right now, I'm just kind of taking a breather until the big idea hits me, until I'm reading something that captures my imagination, like Texian Macabre. I mean, that story just sort of fell in my lap. And I said, well, man, I got to write a book about this. Nobody knows about it. So I'm reading. I'm looking for those episodes that I could just bring the attention to people. And again, I've had a lot of people who have read the book say, I had no idea. I had no idea that this was going on. And of course, that doesn't surprise me because, I talk to people who say, well, I didn't know that.
Well, with the publication of this,
they will know. I hope they will.
They absolutely will know. And this is a much needed addition to the Texas history landscape. And I'm so glad it was you that did it, because nobody
what I'm afraid
could do it better.
Is, they'll go into a bookstore or go on Amazon and say, Texian Exodus. And they may think, well, what's that? And they go to my subtitle and say, The Runaway Scrape and Its Enduring Legacy. And I'm afraid what's going to happen is because, well, I don't know what the Runaway Scrape is. And buy another book on World War II.
No, I don't think there's much chance of that.
Well, I still haven't sold out of the first hardback edition. And, for example, Texian Iliad, way back in 94, had sold out by this time of the first print run. And I still have books, and I want to sell out of the first hardback print run, so they'll bring it out in paperback. And I hope it'll find a new reader, because a lot of people don't like to read hardback books. I've never understood that, because I prefer hardbacks, but I'm hoping it'll find a new audience when it comes out in paper, but they've got to sell out of the first print run before they'll do that.
Well, I'm sure we will. You're an active speaker. You're active with the Texas State Historical Association, but most importantly, you're active in preserving our Texas history in about as professional a manner as I can imagine. So I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Wise About Texas. And the book is Texian Exodus, The Runaway Scrape and Its Enduring Legacy. And thank you, as always, Dr. Hardin, for your wonderful work and for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Your Honor. It's always a pleasure, and I hope to do it again soon.
All right. Talk to you later.
Adios.
Bye.
Well, folks, it doesn't get any better than that. Dr. Stephen Hardin on The Runaway Scrape. I learned a lot during that interview. I hope you did too.
You can find the book wherever you normally buy your books, and it will serve, certainly for me, as a reference book going forward for issues regarding the Runaway Scrape and the formation of the Texian identity. I'm going to skip the part of the episode called Getting There, because if you travel anywhere between Refugio Gonzales and the Sabine River, you're following the trail of the Runaway Scrape. So that'll wrap it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks very much for listening. Go find us on Instagram and Twitter at Wise About Texas. Like and share the Wise About Texas Facebook page. And if you'd like to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas, and you can do that very thing. Thanks again for listening. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.